Here are our lesson objectives, and as you read them through, basically we're going to be doing this chapter is talking about the importance of contract law. We're going to discuss in real estate, we're going to discuss some of the basic concepts and requirements that are necessary in order to have a valid contract, whether it be a listing contract, a leasing contract, a sales agreement. We're going to talk and try to understand what these various real estate contracts are about, and to discuss what you need to know as a real estate licensee and as a result of your fiduciary responsibilities to your sellers or to your tenants, to your buyers, understand the importance and the effect of real estate contracts. Remember, real estate is the single most expensive purchase people make in a lifetime. And they don't tend to do it many times in their lifetime, 2 or 3 times. So we're dealing with people that are buying and selling the most expensive asset that they will probably ever have in their life, or close to it for most people. And we're dealing with people that are very unfamiliar with the real estate transactions, and probably also unfamiliar with what your role is and isn't in the transaction. So we're dealing with basically neophytes, and neophytes dealing with a very, very important and expensive transaction that's going to affect and impact their lives. Our key term matching exercise. Let's start with that. Number 1, what do we call it when a new party is substituted in a contract without any liability to the old party? That's called a novation. Now, novations are a way that you can get out of a contract legally. I'm a buyer. I want to purchase some property. I enter into the contract, and then something happens in my life where I can't go forward. It would be a burden on me, and I can't purchase this property. Something's come up, and it's going to affect my financial or my physical or well-being, whatever it might be. I can't purchase the property. Now, if I don't go through with this deal, I'm going to be probably sued for a breach of contract, which may mean I'm going to lose my earnest money and might even mean that I'm sued for damages. So I don't want that either. What am I going to do to get out of this contract legally? Well, one way to get out of it legally is to find another buyer out there who will step forward and go to the seller and say, "Seller, forget Dan's contract. Just go tear that up. You don't need that because I've got a better contract for you." So this new buyer, this new party, steps in and writes a new contract, and let's say it's for better terms, better conditions. The purchase price is larger, no contingencies, better closing date. And sellers say, "Hey, we like this new contract that's come in. We like this new buyer." Well, they will then be, if you will, forced to release me, the original buyer, from the contract. And by a process called novation, the new contract is a substitute for mine. Maybe new parties, new terms, new conditions. But what happens is we get another new party to come in and create a new contract that essentially terminates, dissolves the old contract, my contract. So I'm out of it, don't have to worry because it's been canceled, and the new a buyer steps in, completes the contract, everybody's happy. That's called novation. We're substituting a new party for an old party, a new contract for an old contract. Illegally mixing money held in trust on behalf of a client with personal funds. What's illegally mixing money in trust mean? Trust accounts are escrow accounts. So when we commingle our escrow accounts as a real estate office, if we commingle those escrow accounts that are supposed to be away from my personal bank accounts and my business accounts, they're accounts that basically are there to protect all the parties. And so those escrow accounts, well, I'm responsible for them. I'm not, I don't have any ownership of any of the money that goes in there. And if I take money out of my real estate escrow account that buyers have given to me on the contracts that they have in our office that we're being negotiated in our office with listings that I have, if I commingle those, that's an illegal activity that could result in not only my being sued, but also complaints with the Illinois Department of Professional Regulation, which might also result in my loss of licensure. So commingling escrow funds is an illegal, unethical activity. A contract that is binding legally and legally enforceable. A contract that is binding and legally enforceable. That would be a valid contract. The status of a contract that lacks requirements for contract formation. That's going to be a void contract. It doesn't have the necessary elements that a court would look at that would create a legal contract. Something's missing. Maybe we have a party that's under duress. Maybe we have the subject matter is an illegal matter. Maybe we're trying to create a real estate transaction and sell property that maybe isn't ours, or maybe we pretend that it's got certain elements in it, maybe minerals on it, and we've made those assay or samples up. So whenever we have fraud involved in a contract, that can void the contract. Termination of a contract without undoing the acts that have been performed under that. How can we terminate a contract but, quote, not undo the acts that have been performed under that? That's called cancellation. Now that's important because if we want to get out of the contract and we go to our sellers and say, sellers, will you let us out of the contract? We can't purchase the property. The seller's got two choices. One, they can either say, no, we're going to hold you to that contract, or two, they can say, we'll let you out by canceling the contract, but that means you're going to lose your earnest money. And then there's a third way of getting out, which is called revocation. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I'm sorry, rescission. We'll talk about that in a little bit, where the seller lets you out and you get your money returned. So those are three ways, other ways, that sellers can let buyers out of their contract. So cancellation, well, they'll cancel the contract. You would probably still end up losing your earnest money. The negative part to the sellers is they'll probably have to go to a court. They'll have to go to a closing that you don't show up at, clearly show your intention not to purchase the property. That may take weeks, that may take months, and then it's going to end up in court anyway. Often they'll say, look, it's not worth a couple $1,000s for the earnest money. Let's just give it back to you. We'll rescind the contract. You go your way, we'll go ours. On commercial deals, that probably would not happen. Commercial deals, the sellers are going to be suing a defaulting buyer for as much as they can. But residential deals, probably not. Unconditional offer by one party to perform his side of a contract. So your book calls this tender. We don't talk about tendering offers. We talk about, if you will, making offers. Okay, so we don't tender offers. This is probably something you ought to take out of this textbook and not use that term. So an offer that is being made by a seller to a buyer or a buyer to a seller would be an offer. And then if there is a counter offer, then the person becomes a counter offeree. And basically we go through this process of offer, counter offer between the parties until we hammer out all the terms and conditions. Canceling a contract where each party returns what was returned. Well, that's what we talked about before with the rescission. That's one way to, and they probably shouldn't say cancel a contract. They should say terminate a contract where each party returns which was acquired. That's really called rescission. Okay, So they probably shouldn't use the word cancellation. They should probably use the term termination. So when sellers rescind the contract with the buyer, buyer will get his earnest money back. A description of a contract that one party can end without liability. A description of what kind of contract can one party end without liability. That would be a voidable contract. Voidable contracts allow one of the parties, actually sometimes it can be both of the parties, but for sake of clarity, a voidable contract is one where one of the parties is able to affirm or disaffirm that contract within a certain period of time. Let's take a minor. If you contract with a minor to purchase your property, that minor, after they purchase the property, in fact, even after they move in, has up until the time they reach their majority to make the contract void or to keep it valid. So if the minor wants to, before they reach the majority, they go back to the seller and say, I choose to void my contract, give me my money back. The seller, however, couldn't say, you know what, we want our property back. Because they were a minor, lets us disaffirm the contract. Nope. Only the minor has the opportunity to either affirm or disaffirm the contract. And maybe in this case, the minor says, no, I want to affirm the contract. I'll make it valid. So a voidable contract could be valid, could be void. One of the parties has got an option over a reasonable period of time in order to make that election. An offer is terminated or withdrawn before the offeree accepts it. So that would be revocation. The buyer makes an offer to the seller to purchase their property under a written sales agreement. And before the seller can sign that, the buyer contacts the seller and says, I revoke my offer. So that's basically taking it back, and therefore it can't be accepted. So revocation is any time you take your offer back before it's been accepted. And actually we need to take it one step further. The real answer is you have the right to revoke not only before it's accepted, but you also have the right to revoke before you've been notified of that acceptance. Okay, so once you've been notified that the other party has accepted your contract, you have a contract. Up until that point of your notification of their acceptance, you can revoke your offer, get whatever money back, move on with your life. A contract that a court would refuse to uphold. A contract that a court would refuse to uphold. Okay. This is called a unenforceable contract. And what that means is the contract probably wasn't in writing. We have a statute called the Statute of Frauds. The Statute of Frauds says in this state and many other states that if in fact you are going to enter into a contract for the sale and purchase of real estate, that document must be in writing. If you will, sales contracts must be in writing. If they're not in writing, they're considered unenforceable. So if we had an oral agreement and I decided not to buy your property, you couldn't take me to court for breach of contract. The first thing the court would say is, where is the written contract? And you would say, well, we didn't have one. We just had a handshake. You'd say, thank you very much. You can all leave now. So you can't enforce an oral contract. So real estate contracts for the sale of real estate, and by the way, leases for more than a year must be in writing for any court to hear a dispute on that contract. Rights under a contract are transferred to another party with the original party still being liable. So this is kind of another way to get out of a contract, if you will, that's called an assignment. You see these more really with commercial properties than you do with residential. Let's say that I've got a 5,000 square foot retail store, and my business is so good, I need to get a larger store. Contact my real estate agent. He shows me a great 10,000 square foot property, perfect for my business. but I've got 3 years left on my current 5,000 square feet. What am I going to do with that? Well, we would market that through a commercial MLS as an assignment that the tenant, commercial tenant, that has the rights to that lease are going to assign it to you, the new purchaser, that 5,000 square feet is perfect for. So that way, the original tenant can then assign his lease rights under the smaller unit, walk away without any retribution, if you will, quote, canceling the contract. But what he's really done is the contract's still valid. He's simply assigned his rights to a new tenant. So that's where typically you see an assignment. So we really simply have someone who has rights in a contract, and they simply, in this case, a lease, and they assign it to somebody else who completes the lease under the terms and conditions that were set forth originally. You see this sometimes with residential properties as well. Something of value given to another to compensate them for entering into a contract. Something of value given to another to compensate them for entering into a contract. I don't like the way they phrase this. The answer is supposed to be consideration. Okay. Basically, what's happening is this consideration that they're talking about binds the sales agreement. Contracts have to have some consideration. I call it magic dust. What that means is courts are so jealous to make sure that contracts are beneficial that they want stated in that contract what the benefits are to both parties. Now, those benefits can be monetary benefits, or they can be a promise. They can even be love and affection, but the courts want to see some sort of consideration in a contract. How are each of these parties benefits? Don't care how much it is, but we need to see some benefits. So in most real estate contracts, the consideration that the buyer is giving is, and the seller is receiving, is the purchase price of the property. What's the consideration that the buyer is getting in this deal? He's getting a promise, the promise from the seller that he will be given clear title. And if I don't give you clear title, Mr. Seller is saying, you can come and sue me then. So that's typically the magic dust that binds residential sales and commercial sales contracts. And we could go farther into, all the ins and outs of consideration, but I think that's a good way to explain it. So a court will want to see in a contract the consideration each party is getting, each party is receiving. What's the magic dust? What's the benefit? Okay, we need to have that to bind contracts, to make them valid. Here's a little contract status exercise, and I think it'll be interesting for you. Hopefully we'll be able to drill down a little bit and talk a little bit more about and explain a little bit more about the different types of contracts. So we'll see if we can make some sense of this. It's not my favorite exercise, but it'll do. Okay, tell me what kind of contract. Now the contracts were the types, the elements, the types of contracts that we're talking about are bilateral, unilateral, valid, void, voidable, unenforceable. Okay, sort of up here. Those are the types of contracts that we're going to be talking about. Now let's see how this works. Yvonne posts a flyer around town offering a reward of $100 for the return of a lost dog. That would be a unilateral and probably a valid contract. Unilateral meaning one party's making promises. Yvonne is the only party making a promise in this contract that she's making with the public, if you will. The public isn't promising that they're going to find her dog. Okay, so that's why it's a unilateral contract. Only she is making a contract, and it's probably a valid contract. If you find her dog and you bring it back, she says, "Gee, thanks a lot, but I haven't got my $100." Technically, you can sue her for breach of contract. 2, Lou signs a contract agreeing to buy a piece of property from Bob, but Bob does not actually own the property. We'd call that a bilateral contract. Whether or not it's valid or not is another deal, but it would be considered a bilateral contract because both parties are making promises. Lou's promising to buy, Bob's promising to sell. Turns out Bob doesn't own the property. He can't sell it. That would be sort of an illegal contract, so that would be a void contract. You can't convey title to something that you don't have title to. In a face-to-face meeting, a farmer offers to pay a roofer $1,500 to install a roof on his barn. The roofer says, yes, I agree. I'll do it tomorrow. So we have a bilateral contract. Both parties are making promises. Farmer agrees to pay a roofer if he does it, and the roofer agrees to do it. So we have a bilateral contract. If either of them doesn't do what they're supposed to do, they can be held in breach of contract. And then we would call that probably a valid contract. Oops, sorry. Okay. Valid contract. Okay. While drunk one night, okay, now we got that going, okay. Stu and Bruce sign a cocktail napkin stating that Bruce would pay Stu $25,000, which is pretty cheap, for Bruce's 1957 Chevy. We know they're worth more than $25,000 at this point, don't we? Okay, so we got somebody who's drunk. Two people signed, so we're going to have probably a bilateral contract. The problem's going to be it's going to be voidable. It's voidable because one of the parties was sort of incapacitated. So what does that mean? That means that the party that was drunk that entered a contract has the ability to keep it void, to make it void, or to keep it valid. They'll have the choice. And they usually have a certain period of time to do that. And the times vary on the reason for the voidability. Okay. So it would be a voidable contract. Stu, let's see, I guess Stu is the one that was drinking. I'm not sure. Yeah, Stu, I don't know. I guess it's Stu. So Stu has the ability to void the contract or to keep it valid if he thinks it's a good deal, and he's happy that he did it. Ida finds a coupon in the paper for $25 off a purchase of $200 or more at the big box store. So we have a unilateral contract. Only the big box store is making a promise here. And if Ida, redeems that, then she should get her $200. So it's a valid contract. Luke signs a listing agreement with Raylin Realty, promising a 7% commission if Raylin Realty finds a buyer for his house. We have a unilateral contract here because while Luke, the seller, is making a promise, Raylin Realty is not making a promise they're going to find a buyer. Okay, they'll use their best efforts, but they're not promising they'll find a buyer. So listing agreements are unilateral contracts where it's really the seller that's making the promise. The real estate agency is going to use their best efforts, but they're not promising someone's going to buy the property. They'd be foolish if they did, because if it turned out, say market conditions turned upside down and nobody ended up buying the property, that would be unfair for sellers to be able to sue real estate agencies because their property wasn't sold. So we would have a valid contract, listing agreement that's a valid contract, but it would be unilateral. Only one party, seller, is making promises. Jack posts a sign in his yard that says, we'll pay $200 for anyone who paints my deck. Okay. So only one party is making a promise here. That's Jack. We don't even know if there's going to be another party. Okay. So we do have a unilateral contract, and it would probably be a valid contract. If somebody came up and painted the sign, he needs to get paid. Tom tells Betty that he will buy her house. She tells him she'll sell the house to him for $149,000, and they shake on it. Well, we might have a bilateral contract, but it's going to turn out to be unenforceable. If Tom or Betty decides not to go through with the transaction, they couldn't take it to a court of law. They wouldn't even hear the case because we don't have a written contract. So this would be an unenforceable contract. There are some other remedies. They could sue in small claims court, but they couldn't take it to what's called a court of law because the statute of frauds clearly states that this contract for the sale of real estate is not in writing. Therefore, courts will not hear any case on default. 9. Martin promises to pay Fred $10,000 to set fire to Martin's house so he can collect the insurance. Fred agrees and they shake on it. Well, we might have a bilateral contract where they've agreed to something, but because this is for an illegal purpose, this would be a void contract. In other words, if Martin gave $10,000 to Fred, and then all of a sudden Fred doesn't set fire to Martin's house, but he takes the $10,000 and leaves town, could Martin then sue Fred for breach of contract? No, because there is no contract, because the contract was not valid to begin with. Ruth and her 21-year-old daughter, Beth, sign a contract that's stating Ruth will give Beth a new SUV if she graduates from college. Okay, that's a nice deal. Unilateral, only grandma, is it grandma? No, her daughter, mom, only mom is making the promise, and it would be probably a valid contract. So if her daughter, Beth, gets good grades or whatever they were talking about, then if mom doesn't pay her, get her a new car, then the daughter can go and sue mom for breach of contract. Ike, a 17-year-old college student, signs a lease with the property manager, Hannah, to rent an apartment on campus. Okay, again, now he's 17. So we do have a bilateral contract in that we have a contract between a tenant and the property management company for that particular unit. But we would have a voidable contract. That 17-year-old college student, if they wanted to, could call up the property management company and say, oh, by the way, I'm 17, I want my money back, and they'd have to return it. After they turn 18, Ike wouldn't have an opportunity to do that. But before he reached his majority of 18, he can walk away from it. 12. Kevin's agent fills in the blanks on a signed offer from Oscar to purchase Oscar's home for $210,000. Kevin signs it. We have a unilateral contract, which I don't think is correct, and it's valid. So we're going to go back and redo this one because we have a bilateral contract. Both parties have signed this contract, so we have a bilateral contract. True or false? A purchase agreement is executed at the point where both the buyer and seller sign it. Not really. False. A sales agreement, which we really should call these sales agreements, is formed when not only buyer and seller sign it, but each have been notified of the other's acceptance. That's when you have a contract. So it's more than just signing a contract that you got from the seller, Mr. Buyer, and making it a valid contract. We have to notify Mr. Seller that you've accepted it, and vice versa. If the buyer makes an offer to the seller and the seller signs it, we still don't have a contract until buyer's been notified that the seller. So that's really technically when you have a valid contract. When a mentally competent adult enters into a contract with a minor, the contract can be rescinded by the minor owner. Yes, that's a voidable contract we talked about. Jack made an offer to buy Tim's house. While Tim was thinking the offer over, Jack got cold feet. Can he legally withdraw his offer? Yes. Okay. Hasn't been accepted and he hasn't been notified of it. A real estate listing agreement is considered a property's owner offer to sell. It's not this is false. What they're saying here is that if you're a seller, tells you what they want for the property and all the personal property and all the particular things that they want in the sale, even if a buyer shows up and offers that doesn't mean that they can't change their terms. So just because you list a property at a certain price and include personal property and maybe even include when you want to close and maybe other incidental things that are important to you in a listing agreement, that doesn't mean that that's an offer to anybody. It simply means it's The listing agreement basically is a, I guess, offer to accept offers. So a listing agreement isn't the property owner's offer to sell, it's an offer to entertain offers. Angie, the seller, signs the agreement of sale, sales contract, from the prospective buyer and hands it back to her agent. This is a valid contract. No, this is why we said the other parties has to be notified of it. It's not just the signing of the agreement, but the other party has to be notified of the acceptance of the other party. Tacky Painters contracts to paint your garage for $5,000. They show up and paint your neighbor's garage instead. This is a material breach. Well, yeah, it's a material breach. Okay. The subject matter was your garage and they ended up painting somebody else's. Not your problem, their mistake. Okay. So there's no contract. Okay. Because they haven't done what they said they were going to do, which was paint your garage. An earnest money deposit with an offer is an example of contractual consideration. Not really. An earnest money isn't really considered that consideration that we talked about before. And while we're on earnest money, let's also remember that many contracts don't even have earnest money. If you were going to sell your property to a loved one, you probably aren't going to ask them for earnest money. So not all real estate sales have earnest money, and there is no requirement that real estate sales have earnest money. It's kind of a custom to do. Okay. So that's the earnest money really has nothing to do with the validity of a contract or the valid elements of a contract. 8. Before you can submit an offer to the seller's agent, your buyer must make an earnest money deposit. No, as we said, earnest money is often used and in most residential real estate and probably commercial real estate transactions, but it's not necessary to have a valid agreement without earnest money. It's customary, not required. A listing contract is a contract between a seller and a buyer. A listing agreement is a contract between a seller and a real estate brokerage firm, so false. A listing agreement is not a contract between a seller and a buyer. It's between a seller and a brokerage company. 10. Real estate licensees in Illinois may not require a purchase contract. And what we're talking about here is that they can't write the contents of a sales agreement. What they can do is take a pre-printed sales agreement and fill in the blanks, but they can't what's called write a contract. Only an attorney can write the terms of a contract. We as real estate licensees, you as a real estate licensee, can only fill in the blanks, cross things out that you don't want. That's the scope of your authority as far as preparation of contracts. So you'll be using written contracts that have blanks in them. Real easy, real peasy. You should like it. It's a great deal for everybody. It's really a good idea. Great idea. Protects everybody. Sellers, buyers, brokers, everybody in the deal. Those pre-printed sales contracts are very fair for everybody, and they allow you to fill in the blanks. Speaking of filling in the blanks, a contract that is severable means that one part or provision of it can be held unenforceable without making the entire contract unenforceable. That's usually almost the last clause in any sales contract. There'll be a clause that says this agreement is not severable. If one or other or many of the paragraphs in this are held unenforceable or void, that won't void the entire contract. Only that particular clause that is offending the contract, if you will. So a contract that is severable means that you can't break it up. You can break it apart. Each paragraph stands on its own. And if one fails, that doesn't mean the entire contract fails. Offer and acceptance of a contract may also be referred to as meeting of the minds. So, one of the important things in a valid contract is getting sellers and buyers to have a meeting of the minds where they understand what is the minds and the heart of the other party. Everybody, we don't want any misunderstandings with our contract, because they can cause breaches, they can cause defaults, they can cause a contractual litigation. So one of the ways we get that is we simply have our written agreements, and we work with sellers and buyers to go over every paragraph and every blank in contracts and make sure that they've negotiated each blank and they're happy with that. That's called meeting of the minds. Some people call it offer and acceptance. So one party makes an offer, the other party accepts it, or they change it. Let's say sales price. Buyer makes an offer. In the offer, and there's a blank that says sales price. It's $550,000, and the seller says, heck no, we want more. We're going to counter with 580, and so they strike that 550 out, put 580 in, and back it goes to the buyer. And we hammer out every term, every provision in the contract by this offer and acceptance model, and we then arrive at the meeting of the minds between the parties. The concept that indicates a written agreement overrides any oral agreement is known as the doctrine of parole evidence. And this is something you probably want to know for the exams in this course and maybe for the state exam. You'll really never see this in the actually workaday real estate world. But you should know that courts want written agreements when it comes to sales contracts. And any term or provision should be in writing. If you have a term or agreement in writing, it will always override any oral agreement or any oral presentation that either of the parties makes. So written contracts and their provisions always override any oral discussions or agreements that parties have. The amount that parties to a contract have agreed to in advance will be paid in the event of a breach is known as liquidated damage. So every sales contract is going to have a little clause in it talking about liquidated damages. And basically that clause says if either of us should end up breaching the contract, we don't do what we're supposed to do, or we don't close, we're supposed to, we don't show up at closing, and the other party has to sue for their damages, we will agree that the, quote, prevailing party will receive liquidated damages in the amount of $4,000. So liquidated damages are stated right in the sales contract, and they're in a definite amount. This helps courts whenever a court has a dispute, and when they make their award to the winner, whether it's let's say the plaintiff, when they make their award to the plaintiff, they can look at what the parties had already agreed to as liquidated damages and say, well, you're going to get the $4,000 because you guys agreed to that. And while we're on that, the courts can actually award even more than the liquidated damages. So they award the liquidated damages, it's stated in the contract, they know exactly how much the parties have agreed to in the event there's a default. But they can go over and above that if there's more injury that the liquidated damages might not cover. And those are called compensatory damages. And that can be anything that the court would want to award. So, best stay out of default court. The statute of frauds is the Illinois law that requires all real estate contracts to be in writing to be enforceable by the courts. And we've talked about that. So very important. Want to know that? You're going to see that on some of your quizzes and your final exam. You're probably going to see that on the state exam too. Statute of frauds. Contracts for the sale of real estate and leases for more than a year must be in writing for a court to hear a dispute. Lisa makes an offer to buy Jacob's house for $380. Jacob counters with $390. So Lisa is making the offer. And Jacob is countering. So when Jacob counters, Lisa becomes the counterofferee, and he's making the counteroffer. So he's the counterofferor. So Jacob is the counteroffer, or because he's doing the counteroffering, and Lisa's receiving that counteroffer, so she's called the counterofferee. Buyer's agent Lucille has offers from two different clients on Ursula's house. As she presents both offers to Ursula for consideration at the same time, Lucille is legally required to disclose these contemporaneous offers to both buyer clients. What basically this means, I'm not sure they're expressing this quite as they should. Contemporaneous offers is a form called Notice of Contemporaneous Offers. It's a form. Before a real estate agent can negotiate with two buyer clients on the same property, she has to get them both to agree for her, or him if it's a male, to represent them on the same property. And that's what that notice of contemporaneous offers does. Both buyer agents that she represents are giving her permission to negotiate on both of their behalfs on the same property. Now you might be saying, well, who would ever do that? And the answer is probably nobody. So what typically happens if you're going to do that is buyers typically are not going to allow you to negotiate for you and another buyer, one of your other buyer clients. I mean, it's just probably never going to happen. So they're going to refuse to do that. In which case you'll probably take one of the buyers and negotiate for them and probably give somebody else in your office just for that deal the other buyer client, if you will, transfer your other buyer client over to another agent to negotiate with them on behalf of that property. Probably the best way to do it. Then each of your buyer clients has someone to negotiate specifically for them on their behalf. 8. Quinlan and Tyson is the common name of the court ruling that established a real estate licensee's ability to use a pre-printed purchase contract for the purchase of real estate. I don't think you have to know that. There's a long history to this I could give you, but it's probably not worth getting into. Basically, what we will say is Quinlan and Tyson was a real estate firm that was sued by the Chicago Bar Association for the illegal practice of law because they were drafting their own sales contract. Chicago Bar said, Quinlan and Tyson, you and all the other brokers in Illinois can't do that. That's the illegal practice of law. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, that is the illegal practice of law, but the bar associations, what I want you to do is get together with the realtor associations and hammer out contracts all around Illinois so that there's a written contract with blanks, and we, the Supreme Court of Illinois, will give real estate agents the right then to use pre-printed contracts in their commerce. So I think everybody won on that. So Quinlan and Tyson was actually a real estate firm being sued by the Chicago Bar Association. And they were really being sued. They were really, in fact, the subject of the suit, but the real goal was suing the real estate industry for a common practice that was done at that time. So a good and wise decision by the Supreme Court. 9, a legal remedy in which a court orders someone who has breached a contract to perform as agreed rather than simply paying monetary damages is called specific performance. So if we do end up in contract court where one party defaulted, and let's say it's the seller suing the buyer defaulted. They didn't show up at closing. They didn't bother. They just ran away. Okay. And so seller finds the buyers and sues them for breach of contract. What can the sellers get? Well, there's basically a couple things they can get from the buyer. One, they can get the earnest money that the buyer put up. That'll go to the seller. They can get those liquidated damages that we talked about. They might even get compensatory damages. Okay. Or the court might say, we're going to order you, buyer, to do what you said you were going to do. You must, in fact, buy that property. That's called specific performance. 10, earnest money is an inducement to have the buyer's offer accepted and a means of showing the seller the buyer is serious and able to secure the financing necessary to buy the property. And I'll say okay with that. That's typically what we think the earnest money is all about. The real reason why you have earnest money is to protect the seller, your seller, to protect them if there's a default. Because in a default and in a real estate transaction, the seller still has to pay a commission, even if it's not the real estate agent's or agency's fault that the buyers didn't go through with the transaction. So they're still due their commission. Now in residential sales, they typically don't sue for it, but they could. So we have the earnest money there to help the seller pay for any damage that was done by virtue of his paying a commission on a sale that never took place. So earnest money there is really there to protect the seller against a default by the buyer and the seller having to come up with a commission. Okay, go on to scenario 1, property, which is called property transaction, and do parts 1.1 through parts 1.5.